Hello everyone, my name is Paulo Alves, and on this video series we'll be building a web app for expenses control from scratch using Angular for the front end, Nest.js for the back end, and Firestore as the database. So don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow this project. In the previous videos we created the form validation for the sign-in page and we connected our app to the Firebase Authentication tool. In this video we'll create the code to do a real login. So let's get into it. As we're working with TDD, the first thing that I'm gonna do is to open my sign-in component.spec.ts file, which is the test file. So my tests are already running, my app is also already running here. Let's start. I will start by creating a new group of tests, which will be for the login flow. Okay, this describe is more for organizing the tests. So my first test will be, given user clicks on login button, then show login loader. Alright, so that's what we're gonna test. So the first thing we need to do is to make the user click on the login button. And in order to do this, I will set the email and password. I'll get the login button and then I'll click on it. Now I'll tell my page to just detect all the changes. And right now I have to expect that on my page, when I query for the element with the selector test ID equal to login loader, it should not be null. Just explaining again, we are setting the email and password so the user can click on the login button, we refresh the page, and then we expect that the login loader component will be showing up in our page. After I save this, our test will fail. And of course it fails because this login loader doesn't even exist anywhere in our page. So let's create it. I'll copy this button here. I will remove this disabled property. I'll change the test ID to login loader. And as a loader, I'll just put here loading for now and save. And now our test will pass. I know it looks pretty dumb, this thing that I just did, so the login loading is always showing up, but the first goal of the tests is to make them fail, then we make the code to make it pass, and then the third step is to make the changes so we make the code better and actually work as we want it. So this third step, we can do it right now, or we can just proceed with other tests and then at some point it will show itself up, so we'll have to fix this. I prefer just to wait until the opportunity to fix the tests, to fix the code shows up itself. I think we do a simple and smaller code with this, so okay, let's continue. Let me just make this loading thing better. I will go to Angular Material, and I know Angular Material has a spinner, progress spinner, and I'll use this in our button. So I'll copy, I'll have to import this first in our module. Now I'm putting some spaces here just to make it look better, and then I will import this module. Now we can get the code of the spinner and put it in our page. So this is the code, it's pretty simple. I want its color to be color equal to accent. Let's see how it looks in our page. Pretty big. Let's make its diameter smaller. I'll put it as 20. Now let's see how it looks. Alright, let's make it show up in the middle of the button. So I'll create a class called button loader. Okay, and let's add some CSS to it. So I want it to be in the middle of the button, so I'll just copy that flex instructions that I had. Let's see how it looks. Okay, it's in the middle, but the buttons have a different height. So let's check how high is the login button. 36 pixels, and the button is 20. So it's missing 16 pixels. I'll put a padding of 8 pixels on vertical and 0 on horizontal. Yeah, now it looks good. Okay, so let's stop the designing and let's work with our tests. The next thing I want to happen is to hide the login button, because if it's loading and I'm showing the loader like this, the login button shouldn't work anymore. So let's just hide it. I'll copy and paste this. Given user clicks on login button, then hide login button. All right, so I'll just here I'm setting the email and password again, clicking on the login button, refreshing the page, and expecting that the login button will be null. After I save this, our test will fail. And of course it fails because our login button is always showing up. There's no condition here telling the button to disappear at some point. So let's do this. I will first add a click event here to our login button, and this click event will call the function login. So this function doesn't exist yet. Let's go to our component and create the function. So when the user clicks on the login button, our component has to know that a login is happening. So in order to let our component know that this is happening, I'll create an attribute called isLogging in, which will be equal to false. When the user clicks, then it will be equal to true. And now the only thing we need to do is, if it is logging in, then ng if it is logging in. It's not logging in, then I show the login button. After I save this, our test should pass. Okay, cool. Let's go back to our tests. Let me create a new group of tests here, which will be given user clicks on login button. This is repeating itself, and I guess it will repeat itself more and more. And I'll put this test here. I'll remove this. I have to remove this here also. And now I can just inform that before each one of my tests, I will do this button click. So our test becomes even smaller. All right. Let me create a login loader also function. Login loader, and it returns the login loader. And now I can just make this change here. Okay, so we are doing everything we need for the login, when the user clicks on the login button. All right, almost everything. We are not hiding this in the beginning of the flow. Should we do it now or should we do it later? Yeah, let's do it later. So given user clicks on login button, then show login loader, then hide login button. And the next thing we are gonna test is when login is successful. So let's test the flow of the login working. The first test I'm gonna put here is then go to home page. I think that's basically the only thing I need for this flow here when login is successful. I don't need to show the login button again. I don't need to make this disappear. So let's do it. In order to detect a page change, I need to use one of the elements from Angular. I'll create a new variable called location, which will be of the type location that comes with Angular common. And now I will give to this location, I will inject in it the location also from Angular common. So this test bed here, this class, it is a helper class for the tests that help us to configure our testing module, to create our component, to inject things that are going to be used in our component. So we are going to be using this a lot. So let me show you how to use the location. I will expect that the location path will be equal to home. All right, so I'm expecting that the user went to the home page. After I save this, our test will fail. Here, we are not going to the home page. So let's do the minimum effort necessary to make it pass. I will create a private router, which will be of the type router from Angular, and this router lets us navigate to a new page. So I'm gonna navigate now to the home screen. After I save this, our test will continue failing, but for another reason. No, it's still failing. Alright, it is still failing because this page change, it takes some time to happen, right? And as this returns a promise, our test will just not wait for it to complete. So let me solve it in a simple way here. Simple, but not that good, but simple. I'll just set a timeout of 100 milliseconds and then On our tests, we have this done function which we can call, and then this done function will tell the test that it has completed. So after I save this, our test should still fail, but it fails for a different reason. We don't have any routes with the URL home, so let's create the URL home here on the top. I mean, let's inform that our test has now the URL home. In order to do this, we have to import the router testing module. And now I'll have to say that my test, it's configured with the routes, and now I will describe which routes I have. So the first route I have is the home route, and I have to set a component to it. So which component should I put here? So let's create a fake component which will basically be blank. So in order to do this, I will go to the CLI, to the command line, and I will tell Angular to generate a component in the folder mocks, which will be called blank. So now we have in the folder mocks a blank component, and let's just use this blank component. So again, I'm doing this so the home component that we'll create in the near future will not interfere with our test in the signing component. Right now, we don't care at all about the home component. We are just testing the signing component. So if we have a blank component, we are sure it's kind of a mock that the home component is not going to interfere here. So after I save this, our test should pass. So this is the success case. Let's go to the error case now. When logging fails, then do not go to home page. So now expect that the location.path not to be equal to home. After I save this, our test will fail. And it fails because we're always going to the home page. Alright, so let's just make this test pass. We have here kind of an if statement, right? So if success, go to home page. If fail, then do not go to home page. And now we need in our code a way to tell the page if the login was made with success or not. So right now I think it's time for us to create our first service. And then in the near future, that service will be the one responsible to saying if the login was successful or not. So it will do the login and return a response informing if it was successful or not. So let's do that. I'll tell Angular to generate a service inside of the pages /signing/services/authentication. So my service will be inside of pages signing services, and it will be called authentication service. Now we have it here, and that is the authentication service. When the service is created, we also create, the Angular also creates the test for it, but I usually don't test services, so I'm just gonna remove this. And let's create here the code. Our authentication service, it should have a function called sign in, right? This function will receive an email and password, so I'll create a type here for the sign in, which has an email as a string and a password as a string. Now we have the parameters here, which are of the type sign in, and our function should return an observable of the type any. Right now, let's put just any here. Okay, so let's make this function return an observable. We can do this with the off function from RxJS. So this will just return an observable with the result off. Okay. Now let's use our authentication service inside of our sign-in component right here. So I will import this authentication service. And now inside of my login function, I'm gonna call the authentication service with the signing function, and I'll send to it as email the form.value.email and as password the form.value.password. So I'll subscribe to it, and in case our function returns success, I'll take the user to the home page, and I also have to set the is logging in to false. In case it fails, I'll get the error of the type any, and right now I'm not gonna do anything. So after I save this, our test for sure will fail. Alright, so we have an error and it's expecting that home is not equal to home. Okay, this is happening when we try to do the login and we have an error. Then do not go to home page. So the problem here is that we are using the authentication service, but this authentication service is always returning success, which is good for the success case, but it's really bad for the fail case. Also, there is another catch here. In the near future, we are going to replace this code here with the code that actually calls the Firebase Authentication tool. And when we are doing unit tests, we don't want to depend on external services. Like my test doesn't want to depend on the Firebase Authentication tool. So if the Firebase Authentication tool is down, I don't want my test to fail for it. Not this kind of test, not the unit test. So remember that on a unit test, we are testing a unit. So here on the signing component, we are testing the signing component. We are not testing the Firebase authentication. When we have cases like this, that we don't need to depend on third-party services, what we have to do is to create a mock. And a mock is something that will simulate this service in this case. So let's do this. Let's create a mock. So I'll create here an attribute called authentication service, which will be of the type authentication service mock in this case. So this mock doesn't exist. Let's create it. I'll create here a class called authentication service mock, which will pretend to be this authentication service, the real one. So I'll have a signing function here. And the only thing I care about here right now is the response of this signing function. I mean, if it's a success response or if it's an error response. So let's make this signing function return the kind of response that we need to make our component pass. In order to do this, I will create here a sign in response attribute, which will be a new subject. And on the signing function, I'll just return this .signin response as an observable, because our code is expecting to receive an observable here. Now I will instantiate this mock, so we have a version of it, equal a new authentication service mock. And here I have to tell my signing component that it should not use this authentication service, but my authentication service mock instead. In order to do this, what I have to do is to override the provided authentication service and use the value of my authentication service mock. After I save this, let's see what happens. Okay, we still have this error, but the error is when the login is successful, then go to home page. So let's go to the successful flow. What's happening here is that I'm not telling my subject that the response is a successful response. So let's do this. Before each test on the success flow, what I'm gonna do is to get my authentication service, get the signing response, and tell that the next response it should return is any, right? It's an empty object. So this will return a success response. I could put anything here also. ID equal to any user ID, but that doesn't matter much. Let's just do it. There's no problem on doing this. And after I save this, our test should pass. So everything is passing. When the login is successful, we go to the home page. When the login fails, even though it didn't say it failed, it's not going to the home page, but the tests are passing. Let's just continue. Also, when the login fails, what I want to do is to hide this login button, right? Not this loading button. Otherwise, it will be showing even though the login had an error. We had an error on login. So let's do this. So when login fails, then hide login loader. Okay, so let's just do this. I will expect that my login loader will be null. And also I have to remove this done here, because otherwise my test will always be waiting for that done to be called, but I don't need to call it. So, and now our test should fail. Yeah, and it fails because we are never hiding the login loader. So let's do this. In order to hide the login loader, we just need to do one simple thing. When we have an error, then I'll tell that it's not logging in anymore. After I save this, our test should pass. Yep. actually, I forgot to tell my test that the login didn't work, so let's do this. I'll copy this before each, and instead of having a next here, I'm gonna have an error. So message equal to any error. Okay, so on the success case, I'm calling next, which will make my subscribe, the function inside of my subscribe, be called. And on the error case, I'm calling the error function, which will make my error function here be called. So after I save this, our test should pass. Oops, there's actually something missing here. I'm not telling my login loader to get like hidden anytime. So what I'm gonna do is to add an ngIf here, and if it's loading, then if the user is logging in, then I show the login loader. If it's not, then I'll hide the login loader. So after I save this, hopefully our test should pass. Still didn't, probably because I'm not telling the page to just detect the changes. After I save this, our test should pass. Yes, finally. Alright, so now let's actually implement the Firebase Authentication communication, right? So let me go to my authentication service, and I will need to inject something here. I'll inject a private auth, which will be the type of Angular Fire auth. So this class here will help us do a signing. So let's do a real signing. When the user clicks on the sign in button, I'll tell the auth to sign in with email and password. So now I have to pass the email and passwords. I'll get it from the params.email, and I'll get the password from params.password. But this here is waiting for an observable, and this function returns a promise. So let's turn this observable into this promise into an observable. To do this, I can use the from function from RxJS. Yeah, now we don't have an error anymore. So let's save it and test in our app. All right. All the tests continue passing. So the first thing I'm gonna do is to put any email here and any password and try to do the login. We see the login loader and now the login button, which means we tried to log in, it didn't work. And we can see here that we have an error message. The error is there's no user record corresponding to this identifier. The user may have been deleted. And as we know, there's no user with this email in our database. But I created a user, IT with Paulo at Google, and my password is 123 and let's try the login and see that the error is not going to be returned anymore. Instead of that error, we had another error saying that we don't have this home component. Remember that we just created the home route to our test here, but in our real app we don't have a home route. So let's do this. I'll tell Angular to generate a module in the pages/home. Now we have here a new folder, we have the signing, and now we have the home folder with the home module. Now I'll tell Angular to generate a component in the pages/home. And finally, we have our home component. Let's now make the route available. I'll just copy this from the signing module to save some time, put it here, and I'll have a home component and the routes. Okay, now I have to copy something else, which is this, and import the router module. Okay, now the route exists for our home module, but it doesn't exist for our app. So I'll just copy this here and change it to home. Here home, home, and return the home module. And put a comma here. Okay, now we have two routes in our app, the signing and the home one. So let's save it. I'll go back to my app, put here IT with Paulo Alves, my password, and click on login. Yeah, now we were redirected to the home screen. So our flow is working. The only thing I guess it's missing here is that we are not showing an error message when the login is failed. So let's finish this video with that. I'll go to my test, and then I will create when login fails. I'll also create the then show login button, because that has to happen. Login button, not to be null. Let's save, and I guess our test will just pass. Yeah, And now let's put a new test called then show error message. Okay. And now I'll just expect that false to be truthy, because let's see how we are gonna do this. Angular Material also has a component called snack bar. So basically this is it, right? Pretty cool. So I'll copy this API, this module, I'll import it in my signing module, import it here, put some spaces, and now I'll do the actual import. And in my component, I can now use the private snack bar met snack bar. Okay, so let's see, when we have an error, then I'll use this snack bar with the open function. But let's create our test first. As we did with the authentication service, we will also need a mock in order to know if the open function was called or not. So I'll create here a snack bar attribute, which will be of the type snack bar mock. This snack bar mock doesn't exist yet, so I'll create a class, and this class has to have an open function. As in this case, I just wanna know if the function was called. What I'm gonna do is create an attribute is open it, which will be equal to false in the beginning, but when the function is called, then I'll set it to true. Now let's create and let's instantiate this snack bar, initialize it, and I have to tell my test that we are gonna use the snack bar mock instead of the met snack bar. So use value snack bar. Okay, so now on our test, what we are gonna do is I'm gonna expect that the snack bar has the is open attribute equal to true. So after I save this, our test should fail. Let's make it pass by calling the function. So this function needs a message. I'll use the error.message. It needs an action. I'll just call it OK, and it needs a configuration. I'll tell that the duration that it should be open should be like 5,000 milliseconds or 5 seconds. So save this and let's test it in our app. I'll put here any email, any password. When I log in, it doesn't work, and then we show the Firebase error message. Pretty cool one. And after 5 seconds, this disappears. I can make it disappear just by clicking on the OK button also. And I guess that's it for today. On the next video, we will create the code for the recover password button. So all the links are gonna be on the pinned comment of this video, together with our Discord server invite. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave your comments below, and see you on the next video.